All right, team. Hopefully this works. I'm trying to record this through Google Meet because my PowerPoint's being a little bit weird. We'll see if this works here. But because third period this week is going to be kind of a shorter class, I'm trying to record the lecture I gave to first period so that third period can go through it a little bit quicker, just sort of watching it. Instead of us kind of going over time there a little bit, because it took me about 45 minutes to get through it with first period. So here we go. Let's jump in. Okay, I'll say ahead of time, though, there's guided notes that go along with this. Make sure you are using those to kind of help yourself pay attention and follow along with the lecture. And also keep in mind, I have butchered this lecture from several other, presentations I'd given a normal school year. And so I've taken stuff from World War I lectures. I've taken things from a few different presentations, right? And kind of combined them here so we can say one or two things about the topics that relate to World War II. 7.6 on the causes of World War II. 7.7 on sort of the conduct of World War II, the actual kind of fighting of the war. And 7.8, which is on 20th century mass atrocities. But we're going to talk about a couple examples of some of these mass atrocities that take place during World War II. Just keep in mind the list includes other genocides and atrocities of the 20th century, like the Armenian genocide that happens kind of during World War I, your book talks about, but also things like genocide in Bosnia in the 90s, or in Rwanda, or in Sudan, or in Cambodia in the 70s or something with the Khmer Rouge. Like, they look at a lot of other things besides just what we're going to talk about in here. So keep that in mind. This is butchered. This is a short version. I'm just trying to address a couple of these topics with you and give you some information from outside your textbook. Okay, starting off with causes. Okay, I'm going to not talk about every single thing on each slide, just sort of a handful of things we can kind of carry with us, all right? At the end of World War II, the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that is signed to end that war. And some of the conditions of that treaty, of that peace treaty, are going to be part of what starts the next World War, okay? The big three kind of winners of that conflict that sort of set the terms are the United States, Britain, and France, the Allies. Germany had to agree to kind of an unconditional surrender. So they're not really present at this negotiation. The Soviet Union, who had been the empire of Russia, had to kind of drop out of the war after losing huge amounts of territory and people. And they weren't involved in this peace treaty. Even though they were with the Allies at the start of the war, they were now sort of communists and they weren't kind of welcome to participate anymore. The results of this treaty end up taking away a lot of territory from the German Empire. Not even stuff they had sort of gained in the war, but just things that, had been Germany a couple decades before were no longer Germany. It was divided between France, Poland, Denmark, all got little pieces of German territory. Germany had to sign a couple articles or agree to a couple of the articles of the treaty, such as Article 231, the war guilt clause, as it's called, that declared Germany and Austria solely responsible for starting the war, right? Austria, for sure, we could agree, attacked Serbia, and then it was a cascade of alliances of everybody getting involved there, right? Questionable if Germany was, in fact, solely responsible for starting the war, but that's what they had to sign to end the war. Article 232 and 233 basically said that Germany and Austria would pay reparations, something around 33 billion gold marks, which is close to $1 trillion in today's money, all right, would be paid from Germany to France, for example. In addition, France, Italy, and Britain also wanted territory. One thing to keep in mind is that right after the war would be the Great Depression soon, right? And also other kind of like terrible economic circumstances in Germany, where Germany still had to try and make these payments, to France. And that built all kind of resentment and bitterness. France, Italy, and Britain also wanted territory in, colonial areas, things like that they were taking from the Germans as well, right? So they came out as major losers from this conflict. Article 160 reduced their military to 100,000, the German military, eliminated their air force. All these things were kind of like humiliating results for the German army. That's one sort of set of things that could contribute to the cause of the Second World War. Other things include the Great Depression, which is happening sort of on top of all those changes, right? The Great Depression was a global economic crisis, all right? It led to, among many other things, massive unemployment around the world. In Britain, 1 in 4 workers were unemployed. You had similar numbers in the United States, 25, 30% of the country out of work. In Germany, it was one of the highest numbers that there was, with something like 40% of the population being unemployed and in desperate situations, right? The government and businesses tried to cut costs a lot by reducing wages for workers, which wasn't great for the workers, but helped keep more people on the payroll, right? If we lower wages for some, keep more people hired. But this made it harder for the people that still had jobs, right? I mean, they were still getting paid, but not enough to sort of make ends meet. So the big idea there is that you had a lot of these sort of desperate people. Those desperate people turned to populist movements, right? Populism can take all kinds of forms, from very conservative kind of right-wing sort of movements to very liberal kind of left-wing sort of movements. The populist idea is it's something sort of where the people themselves are sort of agitating or like popularly in support of this idea, right? Something that appeals to the common person, the worker, and so on, right? Well, in the United States, the populist kind of agenda resulted in the New Deal, right? And the creation of the kind of welfare state, things like unemployment insurance, Social Security, or even just like welfare, food stamps, government aid, government provided jobs, things like that as a solution to the Great Depression. But elsewhere, people were turning to new ideologies like fascism, which is a kind of super militaristic sort of nationalism, I guess, that you read about a little bit if you read the Benito Mussolini essay. In addition to kind of fascist ideas becoming popular around the world, Marxism, socialism, kind of communist ideas are also growing, right? Since the Russian Revolution and before. And they too are becoming very popular around the world. Both fascists and communists believe that capitalism had kind of failed in this Great Depression, and that their agenda, their communist or fascist agendas, would be a solution, right? And in some cases, I mean, maybe they were, right? The Soviet Union's economy, the kind of only sort of communist, we'll say, state in the world at that time, continued to grow during the Great Depression, because in a lot of ways, like, they were separate from a lot of the problems that caused it, right? The stock market, things like that. They didn't have in a communist state, right? So they weren't affected by the capitalist, upheaval that was going on. In these fascist states, Italy, Germany, they were so militaristic that one of the things they were doing was rebuilding the army. And that got rid of a lot of the unemployment, right? The government was able to provide jobs for people to build roads and, do all this other stuff that also seemed to kind of work out, right? Made fascism, communism, even though they're kind of supposedly polar opposites, seem very appealing to people. Looking at specific countries, starting with Japan, we can talk about some of the things that help to kind of create motivations for war within certain countries, right? So we've talked about Japan a little bit over the last few weeks, such as their time during imperialism, when they, along with European countries, were starting to expand their empire in China, right? Goes all the way kind of back then. The Japanese and Chinese had a war that the Japanese won, if you remember, and they capture some territory in China. They get Korea, things like that, Taiwan. They have a war with Russia, where The world kind of thinks Russia's going to win. Japan manages to kind of get some sneak attacks in, cause massive damage to the Russian military and navy, and kind of wins this great victory over Russia, humiliates Russia, gains all this territory and respect on the world stage. And then during World War I, they participate on the side of the winners, right, the Allies, and take German colonies in East Asia, in China, and in the Pacific Ocean, the islands in the Pacific that Germany controlled, and are, looking like they're kind of going to be a part of this clique, this posse of sort of Western imperialist countries, Great Britain, France, the United States, things like that. But one of the things that is organized after World War I was the League of Nations. If you kind of recall from your chapter 20 reading, the League of Nations, the goal of the League of Nations was to prevent future conflicts, right? Was to prevent anything like World War I from happening again by, one, providing sort of a forum, a stage where world leaders could discuss with each other conflict before it turned violent, but also to have countries intervene if possible, right? Militarily, to stop a conflict from becoming larger before it did. A lot like what the UN does today, right? Only the UN kind of works. The League of Nations didn't really work very well. One thing that upset Japan a very great deal and kind of pushes them away from the Allies is during this, some of these early meetings of the League of Nations, Japan suggested a racial equality proposal. They wanted a law basically put into the charter of the League of Nations that would say all the races were equal and they should all be treated the same as, European whites or whatever, right? Shouldn't matter that you're Asian or, East Asian or African or South American or whatever. Like every race or ethnic group should sort of be treated equally within this international organization, the League of Nations. Most of the League agreed with this, but for political kind of social reasons, Britain and the United States stopped it from happening. If you consider those countries, all right, our own, right, the United States we can go with, we had an apartheid state, right? We did not have a racially equal country. How were we gonna be in favor of a racially equal globe, right? Britain controlled colonies all over the world, right? As did some of these other countries. Like, how is Britain going to say all the races are equal when they were, they weren't controlling a lot of white areas? You know what I mean? Like, sort of implied in imperialism is a kind of racism, right? Like, our people can rule this area better than you, right? So both of our countries were against it, right? United States, like, we're not ready to have racial equality in the United States in 1918, 1919. So we're against it. And Great Britain controls half the world that are, dark-skinned peoples and stuff, and they're not ready to sign on to something saying total racial equality. So Japan kind of gets embarrassed a little bit, aggravated. They're upset. They get denied a simple thing like, let's just say all the races are equal, right? So they don't think great of that, but they stick around for a little while. Has some of these pictures, but pictures of Japanese soldiers and Russian soldiers during the war there. A Russo-Japanese meme I saw a couple years ago I thought was funny. And the territories of Japan kind of right prior to World War II, right? The stuff that they captured from Zarashans, like the Sakhalin Islands, they're called, Korea, the Liaodong Peninsula up here. I think they had a place in here, Qingdao as well, Taiwan, and then a bunch of these islands in the Pacific were controlled by Germany, and Japan took all of those as well. All right, so Japan kind of is coming to the table a little bit upset as well. In Italy, we can talk about Mussolini and the rise of the fascists there, okay, as a cause. As one of the things that's going to sort of help instigate World War II. Italian veterans from World War I upset about Italy not gaining territory, and a lot of this stuff can go for Germany as well, right? German veterans and stuff from World War I, upset about not gaining territory, upset about the economic disruption the war had on their country, returned home, very upset, very agitated. They had switched sides during the war, hoping to gain extra, territory they were promised. But when the war ended, they didn't get any of that stuff, right? They felt a little bit cheated by the Allies. That being said as well, at home, trade unions, communist parties, socialist parties kind of threatened the social political order of the country with strikes, right? With, demanding higher wages, and as kind of like depression conditions set in, these kind of bad post-war economic problems, even before the Depression, there was a lot of kind of chaos in the streets, right? Riots, strikes, things like that. The political parties of Italy bickered endlessly, right? We're ineffectual. We're sort of gridlocked, right? Similar to what we see in the United States sometimes, honestly. And then along came Benito Mussolini, all right? Who is born in 1883, who's going to die in the middle of World War II, kind of killed by his own people, sort of, right? Sort of brutally murdered by his own people. But he's one of the bad guys, so we don't feel too bad for him. But Benito Mussolini was the leader of the sort of fascist party of Italy, a political party, not to compare them to like Democrats or Republicans, but in the same way that, there's a Democrat party, a Republican party. There was a fascist party in Italy, and there's a socialist party, things like that as well. And this fascist party had very active members, right? Some percentage of its membership was very active on the street level, going to protests, going to, big like rallies and meetings and stuff like that, and took a very direct and violent and active role in pushing fascist ideas, right? They destroyed offices of socialist newspapers, these black shirts, right? This kind of like these thugs, these activists of the political party. Again, I don't want to make comparisons to the United States because, everybody's got the side that they're on, but you can think of, similar groups on both sides that have done sort of violent actions in the streets, right? You got to think of that, but like a group that's officially associated with a fascist party. Like people might associate, Antifa with like liberal Democrats, or like the people that stormed the Capitol as like, Trump's party or something like that, right? Only it's not like there's kind of a connection. These black shirts are like members of this fascist party out there doing violence, like for the party in Italy, right? And they would do that, attack socialist newspapers that wrote against them, attack striking workers and try and force them back to work, and so on. And, as you learn sort of more about fascism, you'll kind of hear about what their solution was to, striking workers and stuff like that. We won't get into that right here. Mussolini himself, like Adolf Hitler, was a very charismatic speaker. Your lecture notes have a link there. I encourage you to watch. We won't get to share any of these videos here. You'll have to watch them on your own. There's a couple speeches I think I have in there of Benito Mussolini. You can kind of see him. And if you watch long enough, you see he comes off as kind of a cool guy. He's Italian, who are all pretty cool. But you can sort of see the appeal a little bit, the swagger this guy kind of has on stage, even if he is not great. I mean, he's not a monster, maybe necessarily like Hitler or Stalin or something, but he's not great. So fascism, the idea he sort of espouses, this is a picture of Benito Mussolini when he's arrested. Actually, he starts off as a socialist and is arrested, as a younger man. But fascism it's hard to pin it down, right? You talk to 20 different people, you'll get kind of 20 different descriptions of fascism. But the basics we can say is it is an intensely nationalistic ideology. It adores the state, right? Like your country first and above all, and, all that. Seeks to kind of revitalize a nation is kind of like a common fascist agenda. Things are bad. We've sort of declined because of this, because of the liberals or the communists or these foreigners, right? These are all kinds of things Mussolini talked about. And it's our ideas, our agenda that's going to sort of make this place, well, that's going to sort of improve the country again, right? it favored kind of direct violent action, direct action over sort of reflection, discussion, debate. It was a get out there and make it happen in the streets kind of movement. Well, that often was violent, right, in the streets, and disliked sort of individualism. You should put the state before yourself. Liberalism, they thought, was like a corrupting kind of influence in society. Feminism, which they saw as like breaking down traditional family roles and like, feminizing men and things like that. They were sort of against it. Democracy, which you can read sort of about Mussolini's perspectives on democracy, where he thought it's sort of a goofy. Why are you going to let people vote on? People don't know anything about anything. Why are you going to let them make these decisions? And communism, which fascists were not communists, and technically they were still. This is the big difference, really. Like I think one of the lectures you watch. They seem very similar in a lot of ways. There's a lot of state control, a very totalitarian system, but you're still kind of capitalist in a fascist system. The corporations and the state work closely together. Sometimes people call fascism corporatism. They're kind of similar ideas, right? So there's this union sort of between big business and the government. But they're still kind of capitalist. So they're very anti-communist fascists. As you read his essay, if you haven't read it already, I mean, it kind of spells it out a little bit more clearly. But the rise of this group and the violence kind of taking place in the streets and their militaristic, aggressive agenda as sort of foreign policy is going to be one of the main instigators of this war as well, right? If they'd stayed a democracy or, become sort of maybe not communist, but just kind of like, normal European socialist or something, maybe they're not out there trying to build the Roman Empire again and stuff like that. So by 1922, so a little bit before World War I, right after World War, or a little bit after World War I and a little bit before World War II, the various fascist parties in Italy joined together to form this larger fascist party. At a party conference, basically, Mussolini threatens the government, says that either the government will be given to us or we will seize it by marching on Rome. 29 October 1922, they march on Rome with a crowd of 30,000 people. They march on the capital, and the king of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, hands over power to Mussolini, and they sort of seize power, right? And then you have a fascist Italy that the Nazis actually kind of came to admire a little bit. Worth kind of pausing the video here for a second to read his quote where he talks a little bit about what he sees wrong with democracy. I won't read it all to you here, but worth reading and kind of thinking about a little bit. Looking at Germany and some of the pre-World War II things that happened there that contribute to Germany being pro-war by the time it comes around, things we can think of as sort of causes. Is the German Empire was defeated in World War I, right? And it gets replaced by this government known as the Weimar Republic, which was technically a democratic state. It was a democracy with a prime minister and a chancellor and all this stuff, right? And looked a lot like the government in France or Britain or a little bit even in the United States at that time. But it had very, very many problems. For example, there were no great political leaders, no very charismatic, inspiring, towering figures. There was Paul von Hindenburg, who was kind of the leader of this republic for a little while, a hero sort of from World War I, who's 77 years old when he's elected, right? He's one of these old kind of generals and thinking minds of World War I. But he's ancient, right? Even in World War I and when he gets elected. And he's a fascist. Too. He didn't believe in democracy. He didn't support a republic. He thought that stuff was stupid and that what Germany really needed was a Kaiser, some sort of strong leader, a king or emperor, somebody who could direct them like the good old days, like the German Empire. So kind of a weird situation to have a democracy, a government of people that don't believe in democratic government, right? So that's one of the big problems the Weimar Republic had that's going to lead to people like the Nazis being able to take power. Is it was not a very effective government because it's kind of thrown together out of, whoever's left over from World War I, we should say, right? Economic trouble. even before the Great Depression, Germany is struggling with the post-war problems, right? Let alone those reparations, the loss of valuable territories to them. But they were also dealing with inflation, hyperinflation, where their money became essentially worthless, right? It was, and I'm not exaggerating, trillions of German dollars or German marks for one American dollar, right? If you wanted to buy a loaf of bread, I mean, it took wheelbarrows, truckloads of money to do that. There's all kinds of pictures from this era of Germans starting fires in their fireplace with piles of money, of people, using money as wallpaper and things like that. There's a great story. I don't know if it's true, but this story I always heard in I think a history class in college, where they say somebody in Germany, some woman had gone shopping and had brought, several picnic baskets full of money to the grocery store, and it had to set a bunch of them down outside the store. When she came out to grab these, buckets of money to pay, somebody had dumped out all the money and taken the picnic baskets, right? Because they were worth more than the money was. So that was part of what Germany was dealing with. And this kind of desperate situation where they're going through a depression even before the depression started to push a lot of the middle class and kind of politically middle people towards the radical extremes, towards communists for some of them, but also towards a lot of them kind of fascist, extremist, Nazi parties. The Nazis were a political party, we should say as well, right? The National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. Nazi is like an acronym. And then the Great Depression. Like I said, I mean, on top of all this, when the Great Depression comes around, on top of that hyperinflation, and people are literally kind of starving, you've got 40% of the country out of work. Hitler and the Nazis had an easy time kind of convincing those desperate people that he could offer them something better, right? And so in the meantime, right, kind of the Nazis are active in the 20s, in the early days, like the Italian fascists. They're kind of working at the same time. Hitler and the Nazi Party attempt what's known to history as the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. And I'm kind of second guessing myself on that one, but in the mid 1920s, I'm pretty sure 1923, they do this Beer Hall Putsch, and it is basically they storm the Capitol, right? They get a bunch of these sort of Nazi agitators in the streets and a bunch of the Nazi leadership, and they go to take over the Capitol building, basically trying to have a coup. There's some fighting in the streets, some cops die, some Nazis die, and Hitler and some of the Nazi leadership are arrested, okay? And Hitler gets 5 years in prison for trying to overthrow the government. Just kind of a slap on the wrist, really, right? It's not that big of a sentence when, like, people were shot, killed. There was, like, no question he was trying to take over the government. But weird enough, he gets out on good behavior after writing a book, Mein Kampf, in prison, where he kind of lays out, all his ideas, his plans for taking over the world. He basically writes in a book and publishes, becomes a bestseller in Germany. But when he gets out, Hitler and the Nazi Party decide that they needed to sort of legally gain control of Germany. And they do that. They make efforts to grow the Nazi Party, to grow its membership and influence in the Reichstag, or in the parliament. And by 1929, they were the most powerful political party, right? They were the largest. They had the most seats in the parliament of any of the other political parties there. The German Reichstag is what their parliament was called. Hitler has himself made chancellor a couple years after that, this sort of, kind of almost second in command that had broad powers in the Weimar Republic. And he has that done in 1933. And then later in the year that follows, the Reichstag building, the building of the parliament building, I think I have a picture of it, is burned down. It catches on fire and burns down. And the Nazis are there, like, as this place catches on fire, they're out front, their hair done, dressed in nice clothes, ready to get on the news and kind of report to, the news, but talk to journalists and reporters about what had happened there. And they were filled with answers. It was the communists. We know the people that did it. And if you give us the authority and power, we will rid Germany of this communist threat, right? Before we end up like the Soviet Union over there, before there's a commie coup on the country and they take over. And they use this Reichstag fire to sort of get control. Now, most historians agree today that there was no communist plot to burn down the Reichstag. There were communists, for sure. Some of them wanted to maybe try to take over Germany. That doesn't seem like what happened here. What most historians agree on is that the evidence seems to point to the Nazis starting this fire and using it as a reason for them to be in charge, right? But people go along with it. They take this communist threat for real, and the Nazis are given a lot of power through what's called the Enabling Act, right? A law that, the parliament passes later, but legally they vote on it and it passes, right? The Nazis are like, they kind of legally come to power. Not so, like the Italians kind of seize power a little bit. The Nazis get elected more or less. But this Enabling Act basically suspended the Constitution and gave Hitler, as the leader of the Nazi party and now the leader of Germany, kind of whatever power necessary to pass whatever laws necessary he saw to fix Germany, right? And he uses those powers a lot, right? But one of the things he does was dissolve all parties except for the Nazi party, right? You could only be a Nazi politically in Germany, right? The other groups had no say sort of in government. So how do you end these emergency powers, right? If it's your team that's the only team involved in government. The idea was you wouldn't, right? You would have dictator Hitler for the rest of your life. They begin to kick all the Jews out of public service kind of around this time as well, right? As soon as they kind of get a large amount of power, they start to enact their policies against the Jewish people in Germany and begin building some of the first concentration camps to kind of house these Jews, some of which get sort of exported or allowed to sort of leave the country early on, but laters will not be able to leave the country, as you know. This is photos of the Reichstag building on fire. This is a great quote. It does, it's great for you to listen to. And I will read this one because after World War II, there are a series of trials held known as the Nuremberg trials, where the Nazi leadership is put on trial. And it's sort of a sham trial. All of them are going to be found guilty for the most part. A bunch of them will be executed. A bunch of them will be imprisoned. But it's to sort of bring closure to the war, right? This is a quote from one of the highest ranking Nazis, Hermann Göring, like the leader of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, during this trial. Something he says when they ask him sort of, how did you get everybody to go along with this? Like, how did you guys take over Germany? What did you guys do? He said this: naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood, but after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy. Hold on, let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger for you. It is the leader of the country who determined the policy. And it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. So he says, like they did, the communists are attacking us. They burned down the parliament building, right? You can see it's on fire right there. And if anybody says, I don't know about that, right? Like, should we pass all these rules? Like, maybe we're giving the government too power. You want the terrorists to win, right? Do you want the country to become communist? Like, what are you guys talking about? You're going to try and take it easy on these guys, blah, 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 right? You call them out for being, too soft, too lenient. Well, maybe you're communist if you feel so nice to these people, stuff like that. You discredit them, and they're like, it's real easy to get everybody to go along with it, right? You can think if that applies to, our own history recently or not. Once again, as a part of this war, like World War I, propaganda is a major component in convincing people to go to war and in supporting the war effort while it's going on. Some of these are great, kind of weird to see, happy Hitler kissing babies and stuff. And, this German propaganda. Got such a twitchy eyelid right now. Things of, a very Germanic looking family with this German eagle sort of, sheltering the German family and protecting them. I've always loved these images of Hitler. These are pictures of him taken like as he's practicing speeches, practicing these kind of hand gestures. He's known for being this very vigorous kind of, charismatic speaker. I don't know. Something about these has always kind of stood out to me where you sort of see him rehearsing, and you're like, oh, okay. Like maybe a little bit of what you're saying is kind of like you are this passionate person and it's kind of, it's just coming out of you. The good stuff, the bad stuff, whatever. But then you're like, oh no, okay. This guy's also a politician. He's practicing this stuff, right? He's looking in the mirror. When do I look the coolest? How do I move when I'm trying to fire him up, right? He's playing people a little bit like a puppet. He knows how to act, right? That's Germany. Japan, so, the rise of the Nazis, the rise of the fascists, right? These guys are super militaristic. They're pro-war, okay? And that's, one of the things we can look at as causes. In Japan, we have the actual outbreak of war, right? So to kind of look at 7.7 stuff, the conduct of the war, this is something the crash course discusses a little bit that you'll watch as a kind of a part of today's lesson. We often talk about World War II starting with the Nazis invading Poland, right, in 1939. But that's a very kind of Eurocentric outlook, especially when Japan is the other, big enemy or whatever of the United States and the Allies in World War II. Japan starts fighting China and is like one of the places where this world war is going to kind of escalate. They invade parts of Manchuria in 1931. They invade kind of mainland China in 1937. Their goal being to get resources and to get sort of living space, right? That's something that Hitler and the Nazis wanted, were Lebensraum, right? Living space. They wanted to expand into Eastern Europe and like have place for Germany to grow. The Japanese, likewise. The Japanese islands sort of lack resources, oil, rubber, iron, a lot of things that you needed for this new industrial world. And Japan's plan was to do what Britain and the United States and Germany and Italy and everybody else in the world had done, or all the powerful countries in that world had done. Like we said, to go out and build an empire like them and get those resources that they wanted or needed, right? And they do that in Manchuria, in this northern part of China here. Manchuria, which they renamed Manchukuo and turned into sort of like a puppet country, right? This place that is kind of independent, but really sort of is like a colony of Japan's. All right. This gets criticized by the League of Nations, right? Who Japan had already, we said, had some tension with before. This gets criticized by the League of Nations, who say, this is a blatant act of aggression. Like, you're not supposed to invade the world, Japan. Like, that's one of the things we said we were against. Like, don't do that. Japan calls the League of Nations, Britain, France, the United States, these leaders of it, hypocrites, right? They're like, you're going to question us for taking stuff over as an empire? Like, you have colonies right next to us. Like, you own Hong Kong, Britain, right? America, you own the Philippines right now. You own these Hawaiian islands. Like, you've conquered stuff all around us, and you're going to tell us we're not allowed to take stuff over? Like, when we're doing what you did, we were minding our own business in 1850, if you guys remember, and you forced us to open up, right? They're like, kind of lay it all on them, and they walk out of the League of Nations. They're like, you guys are hypocrites. Like, this whole thing is just to kind of help your countries out and not us, right? That being said, you're not supposed to take stuff over in the League of Nations, right? So they were right to get criticized for it, but Japan makes some interesting points, all right? But that's, the invasion of China and this, Japanese kind of aggression against their neighbors to seize resources, and the League of Nations response to that, the criticism and how that tension increases, is going to sort of come to a head in a conflict between the United States and Japan, as well as Japan and the other allies, Britain, Australia, places like that. So that's, Japan a little bit. I'm leaving out Hitler, the Nazis, the war in Europe. The video you're going to watch will cover some of that, right? So I'm trying not to say stuff that's going to overlap too much with the other things you're looking at as a part of this lesson. We can say, as far as conducting World War II, it's a lot like World War I. And I took this slide from one of my World War I lectures, but all of it applies to World War II, okay, in some way or another. So World War I was a total war. So was World War II. Remember that total war means that the totality of your resources and people are kind of mobilized during this conflict to help the nation win, right? That everybody's expected to be contributing in some way. That civilian industries are reconverted to military industries, that your people are drafted into the army, that people are recycling or rationing, things like that, right? So total war for World War I and for World War II involved massive increases in government power. I think we kind of mentioned a little bit when we talked about World War I, the institution of drafts or conscription, right? Sort of basically forcing people to join the military, the suspension, the ending of kind of free markets during the war, right? As much as, we pride ourselves on being capitalist, things like that. A lot of the kind of free market principles, capitalist things of like, let the market decide how much something should cost or what to build or whatever, all that stuff goes out the window during this craziest of wars. The governments, the US government, the Soviet Union's government, the German government, the British government, they have these planned economies. They even call it wartime communism in some places that weren't even communist, right? That the government would tell this factory what to build. Hey, you used to build refrigerators? Well, we'll save those refrigerators for peacetime. Now you guys make bombs, right? This is how you do it, and this is how many bombs we need at the end of each week. And that's what your factory had to do now, right? Even if you didn't want to be a bomb-making factory as the business owner, the government told you what to do, right? Imagine that, right now. I think people get upset in the pandemic about the government telling businesses to close, right? Imagine if they told your business, you have to be a totally new business, right? I guess you'd still be open at least, right? But price, wage, and rent controls are all put in place. The government says, bread can only cost this much. You have to pay your workers the X amount of money. You can't charge more than this for rent, right? Because they don't want to deal with riots in the street or something while there's a war going on. But again, all of that stuff is not very free market, not very capitalist, but even the capitalist countries were doing stuff like that. One thing that we're all kind of familiar with a little bit, hopefully from World War II, is the rationing of food and materials. And that's kind of in large part how most people were contributing, right? Is that you couldn't just go to the store and get whatever you wanted during World War II. You had a ration card in most of these countries where a lot of resources that were in small supply would be kind of doled out in little bits at a time. Total war creates less distinction between soldiers and civilians. By far, in World War II, more civilians die than military personnel, right? President Woodrow Wilson, our president during World War I, said this: "Those who remain to till the soil and man the factories are no less part of the army than the men beneath the battle flags." To some sense, telling that to the guys underneath the battle flags doesn't make them feel very good, right? For sure, you'd probably rather be in a factory than getting shot at on the front lines. But here's the thing. You were still getting shot at as a civilian, right? These cities were being bombed mercilessly, except for the United States, whose, civilians remain basically untouched by the war. Pearl Harbor was, some civilians were hurt there, but Pearl Harbor, Hawaii wasn't a state at the time. It was a colony, right? But that being said, it's hard to win a war if, your airplane factories are blown up, right? If you're supposed to make 1,000 airplanes a week and now you can't, you're going to lose the airplane war, right? If you're trying to pump out 1,000 tanks a month and they blow up your tank factories and tank builders, well, you're going to lose that tank war, right? So in a real sense, in a total war, civilians are almost legitimate targets because they are contributing to that war effort, right? And that's kind of the justification in both World War I and World War II. There's also less freedom in kind of both wars. Laws like the Defense of the Realm Act from World War I and the U.S. Sedition Act from World War I as well were passed that, and the same is kind of true in World War II, that they made anti-war protests basically illegal, right? Criticizing the government, criticizing the war, questioning the draft, things like that were basically illegal in most of these countries that, again, were supposed to be democratic and free. All that stuff kind of went out the window in this total war, all right? Your mail, newspapers were censored if they said too much about what was going on, or if they weren't sort of patriotic enough about this story or that story. They could be censored by the government, told you can't print that news story. Or if you sent a letter home to your wife about some stuff you saw in a battle, or where you guys are going to be, they would censor that stuff, edit it out so secrets didn't get out, or so that people didn't be like, oh wait, you did what? That sounds horrible in war, right? Like, so people at home didn't think bad things about the war too. If there's some good parts of total war, it is for women, okay, in these places, in the United States, in Britain, and everywhere. Women's roles, and not so much in the fascist places that were very into traditional gender roles, right, and didn't have as many women working in factories or things like that. But in the United States, in Britain, this is a time when women gain all kinds of opportunities. In the First World War and the Second World War, having hundreds of thousands and millions of men go to war and not be working in factories, not be working at their truck driving jobs or whatever they were doing before, leave those jobs open to women. In the United States, we should mention African Americans too, also are able to work in factories that only whites had been allowed in before, get these other jobs in northern cities and so on. But we'll focus on women here. Now, these jobs are kind of temporary, right? These women are employed sort of during the war, but after World War II, a lot of the jobs were expected to go back to the men coming home, right? Like the wife should go back home and make sure that her husband has his old job back in the factory or whatever, right? But because of these contributions and the dramatic increase in public life, as well as because of decades of, the feminist movement and the suffrage movement that we talked about before, women gained the right to vote right after World War I in the United States, in Austria, in Germany, in Britain, right? It's within a year or two of World War I, the end of it, that women gained the right to vote, in large part because they were such contributors to that effort and, so much more in the public sphere. And the argument was, if we could handle sort of man's work, well, then we should definitely be able to vote like a man, right? And in general, women had more social independence. They had more public life following those conflicts, as they were sort of on their own and out in public a lot from that point on, right? Again, propaganda, a major part of total war. Some of these are great. Rationing means a fair share for all of us, right? This woman taking all the toilet paper. What does she got there? A bunch of cans of food or something like that, right? And this is with rationing, right? You don't get to take home all the toilet paper. You get a roll for you and a roll for you. I don't think this is toilet paper, though. Whatever they got, cans of meat or whatever that is, right? But a real thing, rationing there. This is a political cartoon, swat the fly, but use common sense, right? Too drastic sedition legislation, right? The sedition acts and laws where they're trying to get rid of anti-war protests, but they kind of get rid of a lot of freedom and freedom of speech and, all the things that kind of make America great. So you kind of get the idea of the cartoon there. Women pushing for rights. Women workers at a shipyard. Okay, now get into the last stuff. 7.8, these mass atrocities, all right? Starting with Nazi race theory. Hitler and the Nazis believed in the concept of kind of a racial struggle between a group they called the Aryans. It sucks that they use that word because there's another group archaeologists refer to as the Aryans or the Proto-Indo-Europeans. The Nazis kind of were into archaeology. They learned about some of this stuff, this ancient group of people known as the Aryans, and they stole a lot of it. They kind of copied and pasted some of it to their history, but a lot of it was sort of made up and just sort of patched together stuff, right? But really, when they say Aryan, they don't mean this group archaeologists mean. They're talking about kind of Germanic, Nordic, Northern European peoples, okay? that for the Nazis were sort of like, the greatest, grandest in the world. And they saw them as locked in this forever conflict with the Jews and others they considered Untermensch or subhumans, right? That there was a group of highly evolved people, the Aryans, these Germans, and then everybody else, right? And all kinds of propaganda was used to help convince Germans of these ideas. I'm simplifying, as I say over and over. But what we'd refer to basically as sort of Nazi race science, right, was used to help justify the Holocaust. These are some of the Nuremberg laws, which you can see a little better in English here. Wish these were a little bit bigger. But this sort of like was a way for you to see, if you had children with somebody that was 1/4 Jewish or something, would your kids be considered German or not? They would be. But if they were half Jewish or something, that would not be a legal union. You could not have a pure-blooded German marry a half Jewish person. Their kids would be too Jewish, right? And then it tells you, what's considered a crossbreed, what's considered Jewish, and how you can kind of trace it like the pedigree of a dog or something like that, right? As well as all kinds of like photographic sort of, this is what the facial features of a German looks like. This is what the facial features of a Jew or African, or this kind of race science, like we talked about before, becomes popular in Nazi Germany. As well as all kinds of propaganda used to kind of scare people into believing all sorts of conspiracies, right? That the Jews were a part of some global plot to dominate the world, and they were running the banks and all this stuff, and they were a part of this, communist takeover that was going on. None of which was really, really true, I guess, at the time, right? But it's just used to kind of demonize these people, make it okay to attack them, basically, right? Again, skipping some stuff. The Holocaust, as we hear about it, begins with not death camps, but groups that are actually known as the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen were these special squads of soldiers whose first task was to round up Jews and other undesirables, as the Nazis called them, the Roma, who used to be called gypsies. Gypsies is kind of considered like not PC, kind of a little racist today. We don't really say that. The Roma people, homosexuals, communists and socialists, political dissidents, anybody that wasn't a Nazi, basically, the mentally and physically handicapped or disabled, right? We're all kind of targets by the Einsatzgruppen to get rid of any of these undesirables, like we said. At first, they rounded these people up and put them into ghettos, right? The racially segregated kind of neighborhoods and prisons that kind of spread throughout Germany in the early days. But soon they were given another task, right? This is pictures from the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland, where a lot of Polish Jews are sent. It's hundreds of thousands of people basically forced to live in like 1 or 2 blocks of the city. You can see all the trash and waste piling up. The Germans weren't coming and taking the trash out or helping these people. They were walled into this place, given not enough food to survive, and kind of left to starve and die, basically, right? The Einsatzgruppen knew their job evolved into being mobile killing units, where their task was to follow regular army units into Eastern Europe, into the Soviet Union, where the bulk of World War II was happening, and round up the Jews and others there to be killed, usually executed and buried in mass graves. A big chunk of the early deaths of the Holocaust come from these Einsatzgruppen, not from death camps and gas chambers and things like that, but from these people being shot in fields outside of their villages in Soviet Russia or something, right? But this was too slow for the Nazis. Death camps, like you learn about in other classes, became the new means of mass murder, this very industrial way of killing people using gas chambers, train networks, concentrated camps where you can get people to work in factories and then kill them when they starve to death. The early gas chambers were actually these trucks. You can imagine sort of like a UPS style truck or van that had gas kind of rerouted into it. At first, sort of the carbon monoxide produced by the vehicle at first, but then basically what is an insect killer, but used for people. humanicide, something like that, right? Like pesticide, a humanicide or something, that would be routed into these trucks. I'm kind of talking about these books here so I can finish up. Some pictures of Auschwitz, which was the largest of these death camps. Jews were moved by trains right across Germany, Poland, Soviet Union, Hungary, all the places where they gathered them from, to these death camps, of which, like I said, Auschwitz was the largest, but there were dozens. Um, a lot of people went into forced labor, slavery, basically, helping to produce war materials or, dig roads, do stuff like that. And you would basically work them until they die, right? Not feed them enough until just kind of slowly they dropped off. And a lot of people died that way. The rest, people that weren't as fit and able to work, women, young children, old men, things like that, were killed in gas chambers or sent to be used in medical experiments. Pictures from inside the concentration camps and death camps. This is inside one of the gas chambers in Auschwitz. These are like kind of nail marks, claw marks on the walls of people trying to get out once the gas poured in. The various valuables. This is all on display at Auschwitz that were taken from victims as they came into the camps, right? All the gold wedding rings, gold teeth, jewelry, valuables, the shoes, people's hair was used to make pillows, like real twisted stuff you've probably seen a little bit of before. These are drawings of what are called the Sonderkommando, and this is kind of a little graphic. Thankfully, it's a drawing and not a photograph. But because the Nazis themselves were sort of sickened by some of the things they saw in these death camps, they didn't like to, clear these gas chambers out after everybody was dead. It made them feel icky, right? These poor Nazis. And they made the Jews do it in these groups they called the Sonderkommando, right? They forced the Jews to sort of clear the bodies out of these chambers, bury them in the mass graves. I mentioned that medical experiments were used. Jews were used for medical experiments. This is Dr. Mengele, one of the kind of most terrifying Nazi doctors and leaders. In this case, putting Jews into water, freezing cold water. You can see the ice cubes kind of floating in there to sort of test cold weather equipment and stuff like that. And basically seeing how long people could survive in cold water before they died, right? But using Jews as like human science experiments to test some of this stuff out. They did things like inject children with various dyes to see if they could change the color of their eyes or the color of their skin, for obvious kind of racial reasons, right? And again, a ton of other very important stuff. I wish we weren't rushing through the Holocaust in a lecture like this, but all said and done, close to 6 million Jews are killed in the Holocaust, and then close to somewhere around 5 or 6 million other groups of people, right? Soviet prisoners of war for being communist, Polish people for being Polish and not German, the Romani or sort of the gypsies, disabled people, Freemasons, Slovenes, like Czechoslovakia, stuff like that, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and various other groups, right? There's so much more I wish we could talk about here. We don't have time for it right now. So, but something close to 12 million people die. There's a link in the lecture notes that you have, if you choose to watch that, on the Nuremberg trials, and sort of you can see some of the video recording of those Nazi trials where the Nazis are placed on trial for war crimes after the war, for killing POWs, for violating other rules of war, for crimes against humanity, like committing the Holocaust, once that sort of comes to public light. And oftentimes the Nazi response was that they were just following orders. All right. There is well, I won't say too much. I see some of you guys popping into the live session here. I started recording this a little bit. I thought I'd be done before you got in here. But just hang out for a second. I'm almost done with this, and then we'll get started here. All right. The invasion of Nanking can be a kind of Japanese example of one of the atrocities that fits into 7.8. When Japan was invading China, they attacked the city of Nanking, which was one of the capitals of China historically. And all the evidence seems to point to this can be controversial. Japan still kind of denies it. China very much doubles down on it. For sure, it happened to some degree. The extent to how bad it was is sort of in dispute, but any amount of truth to it makes it pretty bad, right? And probably it was as bad as China says. But the Japanese, as they kind of invade China in 1937 and approach this capital city, once they'd conquered it, spend 6 weeks looting, pillaging, raping, and massacring the people in Nanking. They call it the Rape of Nanking, is what this event is sort of known as. And it's one of the more horrific things the Japanese army does during the war. They kind of have a list of some bad things they do, right? And this is definitely sort of towards the top of that list. The other things they do that are sort of really vicious, they're doing to soldiers. All of this stuff they're doing to civilians, right? Not people that, are out there to fight and kill you, but people that are, at their homes with their children and things like that. Japanese military records on these killings were kept secret or destroyed shortly after the surrender of Japan in 1945, which sort of suggests a lot of guilt. Like I said, this remains a controversial topic between the two countries today that disagree a lot on it, but Japan's probably trying to save a little bit of face there, right? This was definitely one of the terrible things that happens, and there's photographic evidence of it. I don't want to linger on those too long. One of the things that happens a lot is people being beheaded by Japanese soldiers. This is a news story that was running in Japanese newspapers and in Korea and places, that the Japanese controlled, inside parts of China, sort of describing this competition between these two Japanese officers who were seeing how many heads they could cut off as they approached the city of Nanking, right? As their armies approached. One guy at 106, one at 105. They're kind of, I almost said neck and neck, but that's a little dark, a little too dark, but they were, pretty tied up there. But again, like this kind of large scale craziness that's going on, that's important to kind of keep in mind as we talk about some of the final atrocities. Women from Korea in the hundreds of thousands were kept as comfort women, which is a nice way of saying sex slaves during the war for Japanese soldiers. And again, without getting into the details, you can imagine the dark places that goes into. The treatment was horrific. And again, it's happening on this gigantic scale to hundreds of thousands of people, right? The Allies, the good guys of World War II, have their own atrocities that are being committed, right? From far away, though, so it doesn't seem as bad. The firebombing of cities is mostly done by the Allies. And when these cities are bombed, it is, like we said in total war, it is civilians that are being bombed. Over the course of the war, for example, you guys read that in Japan, and in a second when I finish here, we're going to talk about the article you read. In Japan alone, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million civilians are killed in the firebombing of these various cities. The bombing of Tokyo is one of the largest civilian casualty counts in all of world history and military history, right? And there wasn't a nuclear bomb dropped on Tokyo. It was a bunch of fire bombs, right? Just regular bombs that caught cities on fire. The same kind of damage, nothing quite to that scale of 120,000 people, happened throughout Germany that had huge amounts of bombs. They say there was basically nothing left to bomb in Germany by the time the war was over. One of these cities that gets bombed when Germany no longer had an air force or any way of protecting itself was the city of Dresden, but among many, many others, right? I don't want to single one place out like, well, it was only that. You could tell this story over 24 times in Germany, where 25,000 civilians were killed in a single night of bombing over Germany. There's a great historian that I like that makes this podcast, Hardcore History. One of the things they talk about is the dropping the nuclear bombs on Japan. And the kind of thesis he presents is this idea of logical insanity, why it made sense to drop the atomic bombs. It makes sense in the context of the war, right? That the question of why should they have dropped the bomb is the crazy question, right? Dropping the bomb was a logical step given what they were already doing, right? Firebombing cities and killing hundreds of thousands of people at a time, like the article you read, hopefully, described to you, right? Now it was a question of should we drop 10,000 bombs or should we drop one bomb to achieve the same sort of results, right? Well, that's an easy question, right? So to finish up about those atomic bombs, because our next unit is on the Cold War, where those bombs play a really big role, even though they never get used. The atomic bomb is created as a part of the Manhattan Project, starts in 1942, ends in 1946. A lot of times, for some reason, we associate Einstein with the atomic bombings. He's involved in some of the math early on in the 20s that, about atoms and things like that. But Robert Oppenheimer is the guy that really, one of the main minds that helps create the bomb. And he's plays a big role in the creation of the bombs that are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the first, the Trinity bomb that has exploded in New Mexico, the very first, nuclear explosion. There's a great line he quotes from the Bhagavad Gita, from one of the Hindu scriptures, where supposedly he says this kind of in tears when he sees this bomb go off. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Sort of like this recognition of, oh crap, like what have we created actually? Like maybe this was a terrible mistake, right? And he might have been right. This is the Trinity bomb, looks kind of crazy, right? Reasons to drop the bomb, like you kind of read in the article that talks about some of these. The argument was it was going to save both American and Japanese lives, that a land invasion of the country would cost millions of American lives and millions more of Japanese soldiers and civilians' lives, that dropping the bomb would shorten the war, and that, in some part, it was retaliation for Japanese war crimes on their enemies, even if they weren't maybe at nuclear bomb levels, right? A kind of cynical reason is that the Manhattan Project had been the most expensive government project in U.S. history and kind of in any government's history up to that point. And you kind of needed to literally prove, you needed to get some bang for your buck there, right? And show like, we invested all this money in this bomb and let's show the world that we have it now, right? Which is also kind of a reason to use it. Let the Russians know we have this thing, right? And like I said, the logical insanity of you're already killing civilians in the tens of thousands every time you bomb cities. This was just a matter of should we use this weapon or that weapon, right? I'll skip some of this. People get, vaporized by the bomb when they're dropped, but a lot of the survivors continue to have to deal with gamma radiation that does all kinds of things to them, kills them for the most part over time. But even people that survived, these are fingernails. This is actually a kind of common problem of the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where like they're mutating within their own life, right? This is how their fingernails grew out, as these weird, claw things. I don't even know, this worm-looking thing, right? And again, because like I said, our very next unit is looking at the Cold War. This compares sort of the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were fission bombs. They split the atom, versus the first fusion bombs, the first hydrogen bombs, as they're called, are fusion bombs that fuse atoms like the sun does and create much larger explosions. If there was a nuclear war today, they would not be dropping these little babies that they dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were more than big enough to kill 140,000 people or something, right? They would be dropping bombs of this size, right? If you compare them side by side. This is the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear bomb ever exploded by the Soviet Union. The thing to remember is that in a nuclear war, you don't drop one bomb, right? Now we would drop a dozen of these on one city or something, right? And there would be nothing left. So we'll leave it there. Let me close this up here, and I will post this lecture a little later.